Hello there, you're listening to the planet's memory, where time breathes and the earth remembers. Look up at the mountains, those towering giants that pierce the clouds and touch the edge of heaven itself. We have always believed we understand them. We call them ancient. We call them eternal. We speak of them as if they were born from the fire of the earth, thrust upward by forces beyond our comprehension, shaped by wind and water over millions of years. But what if everything we have been told is a beautiful lie? What if those peaks that scrape the sky are not natural formations at all? What if the mountains that surround us, that we climb and photograph and admire, are actually the remains of something far more extraordinary and terrifying than we ever dared to imagine? What if they are the bones of a civilization so vast, so powerful, so advanced, that when they fell, their very bodies became the landscape we now call home? Tonight we invite you to close your eyes and journey with us into a world where nothing is as it seems, where the ground beneath your feet holds secrets that could rewrite every history book ever written, where the mountains themselves whisper stories of a time before time, when giants walked the earth and built wonders that would make our greatest cities look like children's toys. This is not a story found in textbooks. This is not a theory taught in universities. This is a tale that lives in the shadows of accepted knowledge, in the whispers of those who dare to look at the world with fresh eyes and ask the questions that others refuse to consider. Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the base of Mount Everest, that legendary peak that has claimed so many lives, that sacred mountain that the people of Tibet called Chomolungma, the mother goddess of the world. You look up at its snow-covered slopes, at the jagged ridges that seem to defy gravity itself, at the summit that stands nearly 6 miles above the sea. Now imagine that what you are seeing is not rock and ice, but the skeletal remains of a being so enormous that its spine became a mountain range, its ribs became valleys, its skull became the peak that mountaineers risk everything to reach. This is the journey we are about to take together, a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the world, about history, about the very nature of reality itself. The story begins not in our time, but in the quiet moments when humans first started to wonder about the world around them. Long before science, long before laboratories and telescopes and all the tools we use to understand reality, our ancestors looked at the mountains and felt something deep in their souls. They did not see mere stone. They saw gods. They saw titans. They saw beings of such power and majesty that the only way to make sense of their presence was to weave them into stories and myths. In ancient Greece, the poets spoke of the Titans, those primordial giants who ruled the world before the gods of Olympus rose to power. When Zeus and his siblings defeated the Titans, they did not simply kill them. They imprisoned them. Some were cast into the darkest depths of Tartarus, that underworld prison far below the earth. But what if others were turned to stone, transformed by divine power into the very mountains that now dot the landscape of Greece and beyond? The ancient Greeks were not alone in this vision. Across the world, separated by vast oceans and thousands of miles, other cultures told remarkably similar stories. In Norse mythology, the world itself was created from the body of Ymir, the first giant. When Odin and his brothers slew Ymir, they did not waste any part of him. His flesh became the earth, his blood became the seas. His bones became the mountains. His skull became the dome of the sky itself. The Norse people looked at the mountains of Scandinavia and saw not random formations of rock, but the actual skeletal remains of that primordial giant, still supporting the world even in death. In Native American traditions, many tribes speak of a time when giants walked the earth, beings of tremendous size and power, who shaped the landscape with their bare hands. The Iroquois tell of stone giants, the Genosgawa, who were eventually defeated and turned to stone, their bodies becoming the boulders and cliff faces that mark the land. The Paiute people speak of the Sitekar, red-haired giants who once lived in caves and terrorized their ancestors until they were finally destroyed, their remains becoming part of the mountains themselves. These stories span continents and cultures that had no contact with each other, no way to share their myths and legends, yet the theme remains constant. Giants existed, giants fell. Giants became the mountains. For centuries, scholars have dismissed these tales as mere mythology, as the primitive attempts of unsophisticated people to explain geological phenomena they could not understand. But what if those scholars were wrong? What if our ancestors were not making up stories to explain the unknown, but rather preserving memories of something real, something that actually happened in the distant past? What if the consistency of these myths across cultures is not coincidence, but evidence of a shared human experience, a collective memory of a time when beings of enormous size did indeed walk the earth, and when those beings fell, their bodies literally became the landscape we now inhabit? The first person in modern times to seriously consider this possibility was not a scientist or a scholar, but a simple farmer in the American Midwest in the 1800s. His name has been lost to history, but his story survives in local newspapers and journals of the time. While ploughing his field one spring morning, his plough struck something hard beneath the soil. Thinking it was a rock, he dug around it, intending to remove it so he could continue his work. But what he uncovered was not a rock, it was a bone. A massive bone, far larger than anything from any animal he had ever seen. As he dug further, he found more bones, each one enormous, each one carefully shaped and jointed in ways that suggested they had once been part of a living creature. The local doctor examined the bones and declared them to be from some unknown species of giant animal, perhaps a type of elephant or prehistoric beast. But the farmer was not convinced. The bones were too perfectly formed, too clearly humanoid in their structure. He believed he had found the remains of a giant, and he spent the rest of his life trying to convince others of his discovery. His story was not unique. Throughout the 18 and 1900s, newspapers across America and Europe regularly reported the discovery of giant skeletons, bones of such size that they could only have come from beings 2 or 3 times the height of normal humans. These discoveries were made by farmers, miners, construction workers, ordinary people going about their daily business, who stumbled upon something extraordinary. The Smithsonian Institution and other museums collected many of these bones, promising to study them and reveal their secrets. But then something strange happened. The bones began to disappear. Museums that had proudly displayed giant skeletons suddenly removed them from view. Scientists who had written papers about the discovery suddenly changed their conclusions, declaring the bones to be from known animals or outright hoaxes. Researchers who persisted in studying the giant bones found their careers destroyed, their reputations ruined. It was as if someone, or some group, had decided that the existence of giants must be hidden from the public, that this knowledge was too dangerous or too disruptive to be allowed into mainstream consciousness. To understand how mountains could possibly be the remains of a dead civilization, we must first look at the mountains themselves with new eyes. When geologists study mountains, they see layers of sedimentary rock, igneous intrusions, metamorphic transformations. They see the results of tectonic plates colliding, of volcanic eruptions, of erosion and weathering over millions of years. Their explanations are elegant and comprehensive, backed by decades of research and observation. But what if they are looking at the evidence through the wrong lens? What if the very tools and theories they use to interpret what they see have been designed to prevent them from recognizing what is really there? Consider the structure of a typical mountain range. The Rockies, the Andes, the Himalayas. These ranges do not consist of random piles of rock scattered across the landscape. They follow specific patterns. They have spines, central ridges that run for hundreds or thousands of miles, with smaller ridges branching off like ribs. They have distinct heads and tails, beginnings and endings. They rise from the surrounding terrain in ways that suggest they were once connected to something, that they are not complete unto themselves, but rather parts of a larger whole. When viewed from above, from satellites or high-altitude aircraft, these patterns become even more striking. The Andes, stretching along the western coast of South America for more than 4,000 miles, look remarkably like a spine, with the individual peaks representing vertebrae, the valleys between them representing the spaces where soft tissue once connected bone to bone. The smaller ranges that branch off from the main spine look exactly like ribs, curved and regular, protecting something that once lay within. Now consider the composition of mountains. Yes, they are made of rock, but not all rock is the same. The rock that makes up mountains is different from the rock that makes up the surrounding lowlands. It is denser, harder, more resistant to erosion. In many cases, it contains minerals and elements that are rare in the surrounding area, as if it came from somewhere else, as if it was not formed in place, but rather deposited there by some other process. Geologists explain this by talking about uplift, about how rock from deep within the earth is pushed upward by tectonic forces. But what if there is another explanation? What if the rock that makes up mountains is not ordinary rock at all, but rather fossilized organic material, the petrified remains of bone and tissue that have turned to stone over vast periods of time? This process, called permineralization, is well known in paleontology. Dinosaur bones turn to rock, ancient trees turn to stone. Why could the same process not work on a much larger scale, transforming the bodies of giants into the mountains we see today? There is another aspect of mountains that geologists struggle to explain satisfactorily. This is the presence of caves and tunnels that penetrate deep into the mountains, forming complex networks that sometimes extend for miles. The official explanation is that these caves are formed by water, by streams and rivers that gradually dissolve the rock over millions of years, creating hollow spaces and passages. But many caves do not follow the patterns that water erosion would create. They do not always flow downhill. They do not always follow the easiest path through the rock. Some caves have chambers that are remarkably symmetrical, with smooth walls and flat floors that look more like rooms than natural formations. Some have passages that turn at right angles, that branch and reconnect in ways that seem almost deliberate. What if these caves are not formed by water, but are instead the hollow spaces left behind when the soft tissues of giant bodies decayed, leaving only the hard, mineralized skeleton? What if they are the remains of blood vessels and organs, of the internal structure of beings so large that their cardiovascular systems alone could accommodate human explorers? The presence of crystals and minerals inside many mountain caves adds another layer to this mystery. Caves around the world are famous for their crystal formations, from the massive selenite crystals of Mexico's Cave of Crystals to the glittering stalactites and stalagmites of Carlsbad Caverns. These crystals form when mineral-rich water seeps through rock and deposits its dissolved minerals in hollow spaces. But what if the minerals are not coming from the surrounding rock, but from the rock itself? What if they are the preserved remains of the biological minerals that once existed in the bodies of the giants, the calcium and phosphates, and trace elements that made up their bones and tissues? The crystals we find so beautiful, that we prize as gems and treasures, might actually be the petrified biochemistry of a civilization that died so long ago that their very bodies have become indistinguishable from the natural landscape. If mountains are indeed the remains of giants, then evidence of this fact should be everywhere, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those with eyes to see it. And indeed, when we start looking with this new perspective, the evidence becomes overwhelming. Start with the most obvious feature of any mountain: its shape. Mountains are not formless lumps of rock. They have distinct profiles, recognizable silhouettes that appear again and again across different ranges and continents. The most common mountain shape is the pyramid or cone, a form that rises from a broad base to a sharp peak. This shape is so common that it seems natural, inevitable. But why should mountains be shaped like pyramids? Tectonic uplift and erosion should create irregular, random shapes, yet we see the same basic form repeated endlessly. What if this shape is not random at all? What if it represents the form of a body lying on the ground, the peak being the highest point of the chest, or the point of a head tilted back, the slopes being the natural angle at which a massive body would settle into the earth? Look at any detailed topographical map of a mountain range, and you will see features that have names clearly suggesting their anatomical origins. Geologists speak of the backbone of a range, the spine of the mountains. They identify necks and shoulders, heads and feet. They map out features called ribs and joints. They describe formations as skeletal or organic. The terminology they use unconsciously constantly references the body, as if on some level they recognize what they are looking at, even while their training tells them it must be something else. There are mountains whose peaks look exactly like skulls, with hollow eye sockets and gaping mouths. There are rock formations that resemble hands and feet, with distinct fingers and toes, each one proportionate and properly jointed. There are cliff faces that show what appear to be fossilized muscles and tendons, layers of different rock types that align perfectly with the layered structure of biological tissue. The Paracas candelabra on the coast of Peru is one of the most striking examples of evidence hidden in plain sight. This massive geoglyph carved into a cliff face overlooking the Pacific Ocean stretches more than 600 feet in length. Its three prongs reach upward like a giant trident or candle holder, hence its name. Archaeologists believe it was created by the Paracas culture around 200 BC, though they cannot explain how or why. The grooves that form the design are cut deeply into the rock, penetrating through the surface layer to the lighter rock beneath. What is remarkable is that these grooves have remained visible for over 2,000 years despite being exposed to wind, rain, and salt spray from the ocean. No erosion has filled them in or worn them away. It is as if the rock itself is different where the grooves are cut, as if the carvers knew exactly where to cut to reach a different layer of material. What if the candelabra is not a geoglyph at all, but rather an exposure of the internal structure of the cliff, a place where the outer layer of stone has been removed to reveal the fossilized vascular system or neural network of the giant whose body forms that section of coastline? The Nazca lines, also in Peru, present a similar mystery. These massive drawings can only be properly seen from the air, yet they were created by a culture that had no known method of flight. The lines form geometric patterns, animal shapes and humanoid figures spread across hundreds of square miles of desert plateau. The traditional explanation is that they had religious or astronomical significance, that they were meant to be seen by the gods rather than by humans. But what if they serve a different purpose entirely? What if they are maps, diagrams drawn by people who could see the bones of giants all around them and wanted to document what they found? The straight lines that stretch for miles could be tracing the paths of major bones or structures within the bodies. The animal figures could represent the actual scale and form of the beings that once lived here. The spirals and geometric shapes could be diagrammatic representations of organs or systems too complex to draw realistically. The Nazca lines might be the most ambitious anatomical study ever undertaken, a desperate attempt by an ancient culture to understand the titans whose remains shaped their entire world. In the American Southwest, there are rock formations that have long puzzled geologists. The Mittens in Monument Valley, those iconic sandstone buttes that rise from the desert floor, have a shape that seems almost deliberate. Each consists of a broad base topped with a narrower pillar, creating a profile that looks remarkably like a mitten or a hand raised in greeting. The Navajo people who live in this region have stories about these formations, tales that speak of giants who once walked the earth and were turned to stone by the gods. Geologists explain the mittens as the result of differential erosion, where harder layers of rock resist weathering while softer layers erode away. But this explanation does not account for why the erosion produced such specific, recognizable shapes, or why similar formations appear throughout the region, each with the same basic structure. What if the mittens are exactly what they look like? The fossilized hands of giants who stood in this valley in ages past, reaching toward the sky even as they were transformed into stone. If the mountains are the remains of giants, then we must ask who these giants were, what kind of civilization they built, and how they lived. This is where the story becomes even more extraordinary, because the evidence suggests that these beings were not primitive brutes living in caves, but rather the creators of a civilization so advanced that we can barely comprehend it. Every ancient culture on Earth has legends of a golden age, a time before our time when the world was different, when beings of great power and wisdom walked the earth and built wonders that have never been equaled. The Greeks called it the Age of Cronus. The Hindus called it the Satya Yuga. The Aztecs spoke of the previous suns, worlds that existed before our own. The Bible refers to the days before the flood, when giants walked the earth and the sons of God came down to earth and mated with human women, producing the Nephilim, beings of enormous size and power. These Golden Age legends share common elements across cultures. They describe a time when the earth was more fertile, when the climate was more temperate, when food was abundant and life was easy. They speak of beings who possessed great knowledge, who understood the secrets of the earth and sky, who could work wonders that seemed like magic. They tell of magnificent cities built on scales that dwarf anything we have constructed, of towers that reached into the heavens, of technology that could harness the forces of nature itself. And they all agree that this golden age came to an end, that the beings who created it were destroyed in a great catastrophe, that their cities were ruined and their knowledge was lost, and that only fragments of their greatness remained for us to find and wonder at. The civilization of the giants, if we can call them that, would have required resources on a scale we can barely imagine. If these beings were truly 20 or 30 or 50 times the size of modern humans, then their cities would have been built on a corresponding scale. Their buildings would have needed to be thousands of feet high just to accommodate their height. Their doors would have been hundreds of feet tall. Their furniture, their tools, their vehicles would all have been sized for their enormous bodies. And indeed, when we look at certain ancient ruins around the world, we find structures that seem inexplicably large, built on a scale that makes no sense for human occupants. The megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru are constructed from stones weighing up to 200 tons, fitted together so precisely that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. The largest stones are over 20 feet tall, far too large to serve as walls for human-sized rooms. What if they were not walls at all, but rather the foundation stones of buildings sized for giants? Buildings that once rose hundreds of feet into the air but have long since collapsed, leaving only the lowest level for us to puzzle over. The stone platform at Baalbek in Lebanon presents an even more dramatic example. The foundation of the Jupiter Temple complex includes 3 massive stones known as the Trilithon, each weighing approximately 800 tons. These stones were quarried from a site nearly a mile away, transported to the temple complex, and lifted into place 30 feet above the ground. No crane in the modern world can lift such weight. No known ancient technology could have accomplished such a feat. Yet there the stones sit, perfectly fitted, supporting the ruins of a temple complex that was already ancient when the Romans rebuilt it 2,000 years ago. The traditional explanation is that the Romans or the Greeks before them or the Phoenicians before them somehow managed to move and place these stones using nothing but ropes and human labour. But this explanation becomes absurd when we consider the logistics involved. 800 tons is the weight of more than 500 cars. How do you move that with ropes? How do you lift it 30 feet into the air? How do you position it with such precision that it fits perfectly with the stones around it? The answer becomes obvious when we consider that these stones were not moved by human-sized workers at all, but rather by beings for whom an 800-ton stone was a manageable weight, beings whose size and strength made such construction projects not only possible, but routine. The pyramids of Egypt have fascinated and frustrated researchers for centuries. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built supposedly as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu, contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 70 tons. The pyramid rises to a height of 480 feet and covers an area of 13 acres. Its orientation is precise to within a tiny fraction of a degree. Its construction required knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that supposedly did not exist in the time it was built. The traditional explanation is that it was constructed over a 20-year period by tens of thousands of workers using copper tools and wooden ramps. But when modern engineers try to recreate the construction process using the tools and methods supposedly available to the ancient Egyptians, they cannot come close to matching the precision and scale of the original. The blocks are too heavy, the placement is too precise, the timeline is too short. What if the Great Pyramid was not built by the Egyptians at all, but rather was built by the civilization of giants, and the Egyptians simply moved into it later, claiming it as their own? What if the Sphinx, with its eroded body showing water damage that could only have occurred thousands of years before the Egyptians, is actually a portrait of one of the giant rulers? Its enormous scale finally making sense when we understand who it was meant to represent. When we examine ancient structures with the understanding that they may have been built by giants, patterns emerge that transform our understanding of architecture and engineering. Throughout the world, there are buildings and monuments that share a common feature. They are built from massive stones, often weighing many tons, cut with extraordinary precision and fitted together without mortar. This style of construction appears in Egypt, Peru, Lebanon, Bolivia, Easter Island, Japan, and many other locations, in cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other, using technology that supposedly did not exist when the structures were built. Archaeologists call this megalithic architecture and attribute it to various ancient human cultures. But what if megalithic construction was not a choice but a necessity? What if these massive stones were not used because ancient peoples wanted to demonstrate their engineering prowess, but because these were the standard building materials for beings whose size and strength made handling multi-ton blocks as easy as we handle bricks? The precision of megalithic construction is what truly sets it apart. At sites like Machu Picchu in Peru, stones are fitted together so exactly that sheets of paper cannot be inserted between them. The joints are not simply flat, but three-dimensional interlocking puzzles, with each stone uniquely shaped to fit with its neighbors. Some stones have dozens of faces, each one precisely angled to mate with an adjacent stone. This level of precision is difficult to achieve even with modern tools and laser-guided cutting equipment. For ancient peoples working with supposedly primitive tools, it should have been impossible. Yet there it is, built so solidly that after centuries of earthquakes and weathering, the walls still stand perfectly intact. What technology allowed this precision? Traditional answer is that ancient peoples used harder stones to pound and grind softer stones into shape, a process that would have taken enormous amounts of time and labor. But when we examine the stones themselves, we find evidence that contradicts this explanation. Many megalithic stones show marks that suggest they were not shaped by pounding or grinding, but rather by some other process entirely. There are stones with smooth vitrified surfaces that look as if they were melted and then cooled, as if exposed to heat so intense that the rock itself became liquid for a moment. There are stones with perfectly circular holes drilled through them, holes that go through several feet of hard rock without any deviation or wobble, as if created by some kind of advanced drill that could cut through stone like butter. There are stones with saw marks that run perfectly straight for dozens of feet, marks that could only have been made by saws far longer and far more rigid than anything humans of that era could have created. Some stones show evidence of having been lifted and placed using some method that left no marks or damage, as if they were simply levered into position by forces we cannot duplicate. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, there is a site that showcases megalithic precision at its most extreme. The ruins consist of massive stone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, that have been cut with such accuracy that they appear to have been machined. The surfaces are perfectly flat to within a tiny fraction of an inch. The corners are perfect right angles. There are grooves cut into the stones that run perfectly straight and perfectly parallel to each other. There are holes that are perfectly circular and perfectly vertical. When engineers examine these stones with modern measuring equipment, they find tolerances that match or exceed what modern machine shops can produce. This is not the work of people pounding rocks together. This is precision engineering on a scale that requires sophisticated tools and deep understanding of geometry and mathematics. The traditional explanation is that the ancient Tiahuanacu culture, which inhabited this region around AD 500, created these blocks, but this culture had no written language, no wheeled vehicles, no metal tools harder than copper. How could they have achieved such precision? The answer becomes clear when we consider that they did not create these blocks at all, but rather found them, remnants of the giant civilization that came before, and built their own smaller structures around and on top of these earlier foundations. The question of how megalithic structures were transported adds another layer of mystery. The Moai of Easter Island, those massive stone statues that dot the island's landscape, weigh between 10 and 80 tons each. There are nearly 900 of them scattered across the island. The traditional explanation is that the Rapa Nui people carved these statues from volcanic rock using stone tools, then transported them using log rollers and ropes from the quarry to their final locations, sometimes travelling many miles across difficult terrain. But Easter Island was almost completely deforested by the time Europeans arrived, and there is debate about whether the island ever had enough trees to provide the massive numbers of logs that would have been required. The Rapa Nui themselves say in their legends that the Moai walked to their locations, that they were animated by mana, spiritual power, and moved of their own accord. What if this is not myth but memory? What if the Moai are not representations of ancestors, as archaeologists claim, but rather scaled-down reproductions of the giants who once lived on this island? What if the originals, the actual giants, did indeed walk across the island, and when they died or were transformed to stone, the humans who came after tried to recreate their image in these statues, placing them to mark the spots where the giants had stood? Every civilization eventually falls. This is one of the few constants in human history. Empires rise, flourish, and then collapse, sometimes gradually over centuries, sometimes suddenly in a matter of years or even days. If the giants built a great civilization, then something must have happened to end it. Something so catastrophic that it not only destroyed their cities, but transformed the giants themselves into mountains. The myths and legends of humanity speak repeatedly of a great catastrophe that marked the end of the Golden Age. The Bible tells of the Great Flood, 40 days and nights of rain that covered the entire earth, destroying all life except for Noah and those on his ark. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written stories in existence, tells a similar tale of a flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. Greek mythology speaks of Deucalion's flood, which wiped out an earlier age of humans. Hindu scriptures describe periodic dissolutions of the world, cataclysms that reset creation and allow a new age to begin. These flood stories exist in virtually every culture on Earth. Native American tribes, Pacific Islanders, African peoples, Asian societies all have stories of a time when water covered the world and only a few survivors remained to repopulate the Earth afterward. The consistency of these stories across cultures and continents has led some researchers to suggest that they preserve the memory of an actual event, a real global catastrophe that occurred in the distant past. Geologists have identified several candidates for such an event. At the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, massive ice sheets covering much of North America and Europe began to melt rapidly. This melting released enormous quantities of water into the oceans, raising sea levels by hundreds of feet. Coastal areas that had been dry land for millennia were suddenly submerged. Cities and settlements that existed on these coastal plains would have been destroyed, their inhabitants forced to flee to higher ground or perish in the rising waters. But was rising sea level enough to destroy a civilization of giants? Beings of such size and strength would not have been easily overcome by water. They could have moved to higher elevations, rebuilt their cities above the new sea level, adapted to the changed world, unless the catastrophe was not just rising water, but something far more violent and sudden. There is evidence that the end of the last ice age was not a gradual process, but rather a series of sudden, catastrophic events. Around 12,800 years ago, something struck the Earth with enormous force. Some researchers believe it was a comet or asteroid that broke up in the atmosphere and impacted the North American ice sheet, causing a sudden and dramatic cooling event known as the Younger Dryas. This impact would have released energy equivalent to millions of nuclear weapons. It would have vaporized massive amounts of ice instantly, sending walls of water hundreds of feet high racing across the continents. It would have triggered earthquakes and volcanic eruptions around the world. It would have thrown so much dust and debris into the atmosphere that the sun would have been blocked out for months or years, causing temperatures to plummet and crops to fail. Imagine being a giant during this catastrophe. Your civilization has stood for thousands of years, perhaps tens of thousands. Your cities are marvels of engineering, built to last forever. Your knowledge encompasses all the sciences, all the arts. You understand the earth and the stars. You have mastered energy and matter. And then, in a single day, the sky catches fire. Rocks fall from the heavens, each one hitting with the force of a bomb. The ice that covers the northern lands turns to steam and water simultaneously. Tsunamis higher than mountains race across the world, smashing everything in their path. The earth shakes so violently that your massive buildings, built to withstand any force, crumble and fall. Volcanoes that have been dormant for millennia explode in chains of eruptions that darken the sky and rain fire on the land. There is no safety, there is no shelter. The world itself is ending, and your size and strength, which have always been advantages, now become liabilities. You are too big to hide, too heavy to flee quickly. The water hits you like a solid wall. The earth opens beneath your feet. The sky burns above your head. Most of the giants would have died in the first hours or days of the catastrophe. Their bodies would have been buried under tons of debris, under layers of mud and ash and shattered stone. But some might have survived the initial impacts, only to face a world that could no longer support them. The sky remained dark for years as dust and ash circled the globe. Temperatures dropped dramatically. Plants withered and died without sunlight. Animals starved. The abundant, fertile world that had supported a civilization of giants became a cold, barren wasteland. Food would have become scarce, then non-existent. The survivors would have weakened, starved, eventually succumbed one by one. As they died, their bodies would have been covered by the elements, by volcanic ash, by sediment from the floods, by layers upon layers of material that built up over the centuries and millennia that followed. The soft tissues would have decayed, but the bones, those massive bones, would have remained. And over time, the minerals in the groundwater would have replaced the organic material turning bone to stone through the process of fossilization. The bodies of the giants would have become indistinguishable from the rock around them except for their shape, their structure, their arrangement. They would have become the mountains. Not all the giants died in the catastrophe. The legends tell us this. Almost every culture has stories of giants who survived into historical times, beings of enormous size who interacted with humans, sometimes as benefactors, sometimes as threats. The Bible speaks of Goliath, a Philistine warrior who stood over 9 feet tall and was slain by David. It mentions Og, the king of Bashan, whose bed was 13 feet long. The Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim, giants born from the union of fallen angels and human women, beings so large and so powerful that they consumed all the resources of the earth and turned to eating humans when nothing else remained. Norse sagas tell of encounters with Jotuns, the giants of the mountains, beings of terrible power who occasionally descended from their remote homes to interact with humans, usually with disastrous results. Greek heroes like Odysseus and Heracles regularly battled giants and titans in their adventures. These were not distant mythological beings, but creatures that the storytellers presented as real entities that existed in the world and could be encountered. The key word here is survived, not thrived. The giants in these later stories are not the architects of a great civilization. They are remnants, refugees, the last members of a dying race. They live in remote areas, in mountains and caves, far from human settlements. They are often depicted as primitive, even savage, lacking the sophistication and knowledge that their ancestors possessed. This decline makes sense if we understand that the catastrophe destroyed not just the giants themselves, but also their entire civilization, their cities, their infrastructure, their accumulated knowledge. The survivors would have been reduced to a Stone Age existence, struggling to find food and shelter in a world that had turned hostile. Over generations, they would have forgotten the glories of their past. Their numbers would have dwindled as they failed to adapt to the changed environment. Eventually, only a few would have remained, scattered across the world, living in the high places where their bodies had fallen, near the mountains that were in fact the bodies of their ancestors. There are accounts from historical times that suggest these last giants survived longer than we might think. In the 1500s, Spanish conquistadors exploring South America sent reports back to Europe describing encounters with giants. Pedro Cieza de Leon, a Spanish chronicler, wrote about seeing giants in Peru who were so large that normal men came up only to their knees. Antonio Pigafetta, who sailed with Magellan, wrote about encountering giants in Patagonia, at the southern tip of South America, describing men who were 9 to 10 feet tall and had voices that sounded like bulls. These reports were dismissed by many European scholars as exaggerations or fabrications, stories told to impress audiences back home with the wonders of the New World. But the reports were numerous and came from multiple independent sources. Either many different explorers were all lying in the same way, or they were reporting something they actually saw. There are also accounts from North America. Native American tribes across the continent have oral histories describing interactions with giants, some friendly, others hostile. The Paiute people of Nevada tell detailed stories of the Sitekar, red-haired giants who lived in a cave near Lovelock and waged war against the Paiute ancestors. According to the legend, the Paiutes eventually trapped the giants in the cave and set fire to the entrance, smoking them out. Those who emerged were killed with arrows. Those who remained inside were burned or suffocated. In the early 1900s, miners excavating Back Guano from Lovelock Cave discovered what they claimed were giant skeletons, some over 8 feet tall, along with enormous sandals and other artifacts sized for beings much larger than normal humans. The skeletons were supposedly sent to museums but later disappeared, following the same pattern of evidence vanishing that characterized earlier giant discoveries. Why would evidence of giants be suppressed? This is a question that bothers many researchers who have tried to investigate this topic seriously. The usual answer is that mainstream science does not suppress evidence, but rather rejects claims that do not meet rigorous standards of proof. If giant skeletons existed, they would be studied, not hidden. But this answer ignores the reality of how scientific institutions work. Science is not a purely objective search for truth. It is a human endeavor, subject to all the biases, politics, and power dynamics that characterize any human institution. Scientists build careers on specific theories and interpretations. Institutions invest resources in particular lines of research. When evidence appears that contradicts established theories, there is enormous pressure to explain it away, to reinterpret it, to ignore it, or to hide it. This is not conspiracy. This is simply human nature. If the existence of giants were proven beyond doubt, it would overturn fundamental assumptions about human history, evolution, and the development of civilization. It would require rewriting textbooks, abandoning established theories, admitting that previous generations of scientists were wrong. The institutional inertia against such a revolution would be immense. It is easier, much easier, to make the evidence disappear and continue with the comfortable narrative that we already have. If mountains are bones, then we should be able to read them the same way a forensic scientist reads human bones, extracting information about the individual's life, health, age, and manner of death. This is where the geology of mountains takes on new significance. Every mountain has a story written in its rocks, in its layers, in its composition. Geologists read this story through the lens of tectonic and volcanic processes, but what if we read it instead as biology, as the preserved remains of a living being, the layering of sedimentary rocks which geologists interpret as successive deposits of ancient lake beds and ocean floors, might instead be the layers of tissue, the alternating bands of muscle and connective tissue that make up the body of a large animal. The intrusions of igneous rock, which geologists see as volcanic magma that pushed through cracks in the sedimentary layers, might be the fossilized remains of the vascular system, the arteries and veins that carried blood through the giant's body. Consider the color variations in mountain rock. Sedimentary layers often show distinct color bands, with red layers alternating with white or gray or brown. Geologists explain these colors by the presence of different minerals, iron oxides creating red bands, calcium carbonate creating white bands, and so on. But in living tissue, different colors represent different structures. Red is blood, white is bone, grey is neural tissue, brown is decay. What if the color bands in mountains are the petrified color of the giant's anatomy, preserved by the minerals that replace the original organic material? The red rocks of the American Southwest, those stunning formations in places like Red Rock Canyon and Valley of Fire, might be the fossilized blood and muscle tissue of giants who fell in this region. The white limestone cliffs of Dover might be their bones. The black volcanic rock of Iceland might be their burned flesh, charred by the catastrophe that killed them. The structure of mountain ranges also tells a story. When we look at a topographical map, we see patterns. Ridges run parallel to each other. Valleys lie between them in regular intervals. Peaks are spaced evenly along the ridges. These patterns are supposedly the result of erosion, with water cutting valleys between the harder ridges of rock. But erosion is a random process. It follows the path of least resistance, which varies depending on local conditions. Why then do we see such regularity in mountain ranges? Why do the Appalachian Mountains run in nearly parallel ridges for hundreds of miles? Why do the valleys between them have such consistent widths? The answer becomes obvious when we recognize these ridges as ribs, the valleys as the spaces between ribs, the whole range as the fossilized rib cage of a giant lying on its side. The regularity is not the result of random erosion, but of anatomy, the repeated structure that characterizes the skeletal system of any vertebrate creature. Some mountains have features that are even more specifically anatomical. The Grand Tetons in Wyoming, whose name itself references anatomy in a rather crude way, are a mountain range that rises abruptly from the valley floor without foothills, creating a dramatic skyline of sharp peaks. The highest peak, Grand Teton, rises over 7,000 feet above the valley in a distance of only a few miles. The range has a distinctive shape, with three main peaks forming a cluster that has been compared to various things over the years. But when viewed from certain angles, the resemblance to a specific anatomical structure is unmistakable. These are not generic mountains. They are the fossilized remains of a specific part of a giant's body, thrust upward and exposed by later geological processes. Similarly, Shiprock in New Mexico, a massive volcanic formation that rises 1,500 feet above the desert floor, has been interpreted as a volcanic plug, the solidified magma from an ancient volcano. But its shape, a central spire surrounded by radiating ridges, looks remarkably like a femur, the upper leg bone with the central shaft and the processes where muscles once attached. What if it is exactly that, the leg bone of a giant exposed by erosion of the softer tissue around it? Caves and tunnels within mountains take on new meaning when read as anatomy. The Mammoth Cave System in Kentucky is the longest known cave system in the world, with over 400 miles of explored passages. The passages wind and branch, rise and fall, forming a three-dimensional maze that has never been fully mapped. Some passages are narrow crawlways that humans can barely fit through. Others are vast chambers hundreds of feet across. The traditional explanation is that these passages were carved by underground rivers flowing through soluble limestone, gradually dissolving the rock over millions of years. But the pattern of the passages does not follow what we would expect from water erosion. Many passages lead upward, defying gravity. Many branch at angles that seem deliberate rather than natural. What if Mammoth Cave is the cardiovascular system of a giant, the network of arteries and veins that once carried blood throughout its body? The large chambers would be the heart and major organs. The branching passages would be the vessels that supplied blood to the tissues. The narrow crawlways would be the capillaries, the smallest vessels that reached into every part of the body. Even the name mammoth might be a preserved memory of the true nature of this cave system, a recognition that it was part of something enormous, something mammalian, something that once lived and breathed. Mathematics and geometry provide another way to read the bones of dead giants. If these beings were living creatures, then their bodies would have followed the same geometric principles that govern all living things. One of the most important of these principles is the golden ratio, also known as phi, approximately 1.618. This ratio appears throughout nature, in the spiral of a nautilus shell, in the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, in the proportions of the human body. The golden ratio is not arbitrary. It emerges from the mathematics of growth and proportion, appearing whenever structures need to be both efficient and aesthetically pleasing. If giants were biological creatures, their bodies would have incorporated the golden ratio just as ours do. And indeed, when we measure mountain ranges and compare the distances between peaks, the heights of mountains relative to their bases, the ratios of length to width in mountain valleys, we find the golden ratio appearing again and again. The Fibonacci sequence, closely related to the golden ratio, is another mathematical pattern that appears in nature. This sequence starts with 0 and 1, and each subsequent number is the sum of the previous two. 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 13, 4, and so on. The ratio between consecutive Fibonacci numbers approaches the golden ratio as the sequence continues. This sequence appears in the branching of trees, the arrangement of leaves on a stem, the spiral patterns of galaxies. If we look at mountain ranges as organic structures, we should expect to find Fibonacci patterns in their organization. Count the major peaks in a mountain range, the ridges that branch from the main spine, the valleys that lie between them, and you will often find Fibonacci numbers. The Cascade Range in the Pacific Northwest has a main spine of volcanic peaks: Mount Baker, Glacier Peak, Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, Mount Hood, Mount Jefferson, Three Sisters, Crater Lake. Count them. Measure the distances between them. Look at the ratios. The Fibonacci sequence is there, encoded in the spacing and structure of the range. Fractals provide yet another mathematical tool for reading mountains. A fractal is a pattern that repeats at different scales, so that if you zoom in on a small section, you see the same pattern as in the larger whole. Mountains are famously fractal in nature. The outline of a mountain range looks similar whether you view it from space, from an airplane, or from the ground. The same jagged, irregular shape repeats at every level of magnification. Geologists explain this as the result of erosion processes that work the same way at all scales, creating self-similar patterns. But fractals also appear in biological systems, in the branching of blood vessels, in the structure of lungs, in the neural networks of brains. These fractals serve a purpose. They maximize surface area within a limited volume, allowing efficient exchange of nutrients and waste. If mountains are fossilized biological structures, then their fractal nature is not just the result of erosion, but rather a preserved feature of the original living tissue, a sign that these were functional organs of creatures that required efficient internal transport systems. The golden spiral derived from the golden ratio in the Fibonacci sequence appears when we plot the growth of certain mountain ranges over time. By studying the geology of mountains, scientists can determine approximately when different sections of a range were formed or uplifted. When we plot these dates on a map and trace the progression of mountain building, we sometimes find that it follows a spiral pattern, with the oldest formations at the center and younger formations spiraling outward. This is traditionally explained as the result of rotating tectonic plates, or moving hotspots of volcanic activity. But it is also exactly the pattern we would see if we were looking at the growth pattern of a giant's body, the way tissue builds up in layers from a central point, following the mathematical laws that govern all biological growth. The spiral is not incidental, it is fundamental. It is the signature of life itself, preserved in stone. There are also symmetries to consider. The human body is bilaterally symmetric, with left and right sides that mirror each other. This symmetry is not perfect, but it is close, and it serves important functions in balance and movement. If giants were similar to humans in their basic body plan, then their fossilized remains should show bilateral symmetry. And indeed, many mountain ranges do show this feature. The Andes, running down the spine of South America, have parallel ranges on either side, the Cordillera Occidental and the Cordillera Oriental, like left and right sides of a rib cage. The Alps in Europe have a similar structure, with multiple parallel ranges running east to west. The Himalayas show more complex patterns, perhaps because multiple giants fell in the same region, their bodies overlapping and intermingling. But even there, when we look carefully, we can identify paired structures, symmetric arrangements that suggest underlying anatomy rather than random geological processes. Stone itself can speak to those who know how to listen. Different types of rock have different properties, different compositions, different histories. When geologists examine a rock sample, they can determine what minerals it contains, what conditions were present when it formed, how old it is, what processes have affected it since its formation. But what if some of the rocks we call sedimentary or metamorphic are actually biogenic, formed not from inorganic processes, but from living tissue? Biogenic rocks do exist in mainstream geology. Limestone is often formed from the accumulated shells of marine organisms. Coal is formed from compressed plant matter. Oil and natural gas are formed from the remains of ancient plankton and algae. These rocks are clearly the products of life, even though they are now stone. What if many more types of rock are biogenic in origin, but their biological source is not recognized because the organisms were so large and so different from anything now living that we do not know what to look for? Consider granite, the rock that makes up much of the continental crust and forms the core of many mountain ranges. Granite is an igneous rock, meaning it formed from molten magma that cooled and crystallized. Its composition is primarily quartz, feldspar, and mica, minerals that give it a distinctive speckled appearance. Traditional geology states that granite forms deep underground, where magma cools slowly, allowing large crystals to grow. But there are problems with this explanation. Granite is found at the surface in enormous quantities, forming entire mountain ranges and vast areas of exposed rock. How did it get to the surface if it formed deep underground? The answer is usually erosion, that the overlying rock was worn away over millions of years, exposing the granite beneath. But this requires removing tremendous amounts of rock, and we should see the eroded sediment somewhere. Yet the quantity of sediment in the world does not match the quantity of granite exposed. What if granite did not form underground at all? What if it is fossilized bone, the petrified skeletal tissue of giants, its crystalline structure the result of the mineralization process that turned organic material into stone? The mineral composition of granite supports this interpretation. Bone is primarily calcium phosphate, but it also contains trace amounts of other minerals, including silica, the main component of quartz. When bone fossilizes, the calcium phosphate can be replaced by silica through a process called silicification, turning the bone into a rock that is essentially quartz. If this process occurred throughout the entire skeleton of a giant, the result would be a massive formation of quartzose rock, exactly what we see in granite. The feldspar in granite could be the result of other minerals in the bone, sodium and potassium, combining with silica during fossilization. The mica could be the fossilized remains of the organic matrix of bone, the collagen fibers that give bone its flexibility in life, and leave behind layered structures in fossilization. Even the speckled appearance of granite makes sense as fossilized bone, with the different minerals representing different components of the original tissue. Marble presents another interesting case. Marble is a metamorphic rock, formed when limestone is subjected to heat and pressure, causing the calcite crystals in the limestone to grow larger and interlock. The result is a rock with a distinctive crystalline texture and the ability to take a high polish, making it valuable for sculpture and architecture. The finest marble comes from quarries like Carrara in Italy, where entire mountains are made of white, fine-grained marble that has been prized since Roman times. But what was the original limestone that turned into marble? Limestone is usually formed from the shells of marine organisms, as mentioned earlier, but the limestone that became Carrara marble is unusually pure and uniform, lacking the fossils and impurities that characterize most limestone. What if this limestone was not formed from billions of tiny shells, but rather from the calcium-rich tissue of giant organisms? What if Carrara marble is fossilized soft tissue, the muscles and organs of giants metamorphosed by the heat and pressure of the catastrophe that killed them? The purity of the marble would then reflect the purity of the original tissue, organic calcium in its most concentrated form, transformed into one of the most beautiful stones on Earth. Salt deposits provide yet another clue. There are massive salt formations throughout the world, underground layers of rock salt, sometimes thousands of feet thick, stretching for hundreds of miles. Traditional geology explains these formations as the remnants of ancient seas that evaporated, leaving behind the salt that was dissolved in the water. But the amount of salt in some of these formations is staggering, requiring vast seas to evaporate repeatedly in the same location, a process that seems unlikely. What if these salt deposits are not from evaporated seawater at all, but rather from the bodily fluids of giants? The human body contains about 1/4 of a pound of salt, mostly in the blood and other fluids. A giant 50 times the size of a human would contain over 300 pounds of salt. If millions of giants died and their bodies fossilized, the salt from their bodily fluids would form enormous deposits, exactly what we see in the geological record. The salt domes of the Gulf Coast, the salt flats of Utah, the underground salt mines of Poland and Germany, all could be the crystallized fluids of a dead civilization, preserved as rock over the millennia since their death. If our theory is correct, then the maps we use to navigate the world are actually anatomical diagrams, charts of the bodies of fallen giants. This realization transforms how we read geography. Coastlines, which seem so random and irregular, might actually be tracing the outline of bodies lying on the ground. Islands might be the tips of extremities poking above the water. Peninsulas might be arms or legs extending into the sea. Gulfs and bays might be the spaces between bodies or the hollows where soft tissue has decayed away, leaving gaps in the fossilized remains. When we look at a map of the Mediterranean Sea with this perspective, patterns emerge. The Italian peninsula looks remarkably like a leg, even called the boot of Italy. Sicily looks like a ball that the boot is kicking. Greece, with its many peninsulas and islands, looks like a hand with fingers spread, reaching out into the Aegean Sea. The Peloponnese, the southern part of mainland Greece, is even shaped like a hand, with distinct finger-like projections that have individual names. The Americas provide an even more striking example. South America, when viewed on a map, has a clearly defined shape, wide at the north and tapering to a point at the south. The eastern coast is relatively smooth, while the western coast is dominated by the Andes Mountains running along its entire length. If we imagine this landmass as a body lying on its side, the shape makes perfect sense. The wide northern part is the torso and shoulders. The Andes are the spine. The eastern coast is the front of the body. The narrow southern part is the legs, the Amazon River and its tributaries, which drain a vast area of the continent, follow the pattern we would expect from the circulatory or nervous system, a main trunk with branches spreading throughout the body. Even the Atacama Desert on the western coast takes on new meaning, the driest place on Earth, where some weather stations have never recorded rainfall. What if this desert is the remnant of a massive burn, a place where the flesh was incinerated during the catastrophe, leaving behind sterile ash that has never recovered, even after 12,000 years? North America shows similar anatomical features. The Rocky Mountains form a spine running down the western part of the continent. The Mississippi River system forms a circulatory network that drains the center of the continent, flowing into the Gulf of Mexico. The Great Lakes, those massive bodies of fresh water that contain 20% of the world's surface fresh water, might be the remnants of internal organs, cavities within the body that filled with water after the giant's death. Lake Superior, the largest of the Great Lakes, has a shape that is suspiciously organic, with lobes and extensions that do not look like the result of glacial carving. What if it is the fossilized stomach or liver of a giant, a hollow space in the body that became a lake when the body was submerged during the post-catastrophe flooding? The continent of Africa presents a different pattern. Unlike the Americas, which have clear mountain ranges running like spines, Africa is dominated by high plateaus and relatively low coastal areas. The center of the continent is elevated, with a gradual slope down to the coasts. This structure suggests not a body lying on its side, but rather a body lying on its back, with the chest and abdomen forming the high central plateau, the limbs extending to the coastal lowlands. The Great Rift Valley, running down the eastern side of Africa, is traditionally explained as a place where the continent is splitting apart, where tectonic forces are pulling the land in opposite directions. But the Rift Valley has features that do not quite fit this explanation. It is remarkably straight in some sections, running for hundreds of miles without deviation. It contains a chain of deep lakes, some of which are among the deepest in the world. What if the Rift Valley is not a crack in the earth, but rather a surgical incision? A cut made deliberately in the giant's body? What if someone or something dissected these giants after they fell, examining their internal structure, removing organs, taking samples? The straightness of the cut, the precision of its alignment, suggest deliberate action rather than natural process. Islands deserve special attention in this anatomical geography. Many islands appear in chains or clusters, distributed in patterns that seem too regular to be random. The Hawaiian Islands, for example, form a line stretching across the Pacific, with the youngest islands at the southeastern end and the oldest at the northwestern end. Traditional geology explains this as the result of a hot spot, a stationary plume of magma rising from deep in the Earth's mantle, with the Pacific plate moving over this hot spot, creating a new volcano each time. But this explanation requires assuming that the hotspot remains perfectly stationary while the plate moves in a perfectly straight line, an assumption that is difficult to verify. What if the Hawaiian Islands are instead the knuckles of a giant hand, the fingers pointing southeast, the arm extending back toward Asia? The islands of Japan form a similar arc curving along the eastern edge of Asia. Are they a rib cage, the ribs of a giant lying in the Pacific, the body extending eastward beneath the water? The islands of the Caribbean form a chain from Florida to Venezuela, enclosing the Caribbean Sea. Are they a necklace, a deliberate arrangement of stones placed on the chest of a giant as part of a burial ritual? One of the most challenging aspects of the mountain as bones theory is the sheer scale involved. Mountains are enormous. Even a relatively small mountain might be 1,000 feet high and several miles across. If such a mountain is the fossilized remains of a single bone or body part, then the giant to whom it belonged must have been truly colossal, far larger than the giants described in mythology and folklore. The Bible's Goliath at 9 feet tall is a giant compared to normal humans, but he is nothing compared to the beings that would be required to form mountains. We are talking about creatures that might have been thousands of feet tall, beings the size of skyscrapers or even larger. Is such a size even possible? Do the laws of physics and biology allow creatures of such dimensions? The answer from mainstream biology is no. There are fundamental limits to how large a land animal can be, imposed by the square cube law. This law states that as an object increases in size, its volume and mass increase as the cube of its dimensions, while its surface area increases only as the square. For a living creature, this means that as you get bigger, your weight increases much faster than the strength of your bones and muscles. An animal twice as tall as another weighs 8 times as much but has only 4 times the cross-section area in its bones. Eventually, you reach a size where bones would break under the creature's own weight, where muscles could not move the limbs, where the heart could not pump blood to all parts of the body. The largest land animals that ever lived were the sauropod dinosaurs, creatures like Argentinosaurus and Patagotitum, which reached lengths of over 100 feet and weights of perhaps 80 tons. Even these massive creatures were at the limit of what biology could support, and they had specialized adaptations, like air-filled bones and hollow spaces in their vertebrae, to reduce their weight. But what if the giants had similar adaptations, taken to an even greater extreme? What if their bones were not solid rock-like structures, but rather intricate lattices, frameworks of incredible strength with vast hollow spaces throughout? This would reduce their weight while maintaining structural integrity. Modern architecture uses similar principles. The Eiffel Tower, despite being over 1,000 feet tall, weighs only about 10,000 tons, because it is not a solid block of iron, but rather an open framework. A biological creature built on similar principles could be much larger than our intuition suggests. Furthermore, what if the giants did not live in the same gravitational field that we experience today? Some researchers have proposed that the Earth's gravity was lower in the past, perhaps significantly lower, which would have allowed much larger creatures to exist. This idea is controversial and not accepted by mainstream science, but it is not impossible. If the Earth's mass or rotational speed or the distribution of mass within the Earth were different, then surface gravity would have been different as well. There is another possibility that takes us into even more speculative territory. What if the giants were not entirely biological creatures as we understand biology? What if they were hybrids, combinations of organic tissue and something else, perhaps crystalline structures, or even technology? Many ancient myths speak of the giants as being different from normal living creatures, as having powers and abilities that seem magical or supernatural. What if these stories preserve memories of beings that incorporated materials and principles that gave them capabilities beyond what pure biology could achieve? Silicon-based life forms, long a staple of science fiction, might sound absurd, but silicon is actually more abundant on Earth than carbon, and can form complex molecules similar to those used by carbon-based life. If the giants incorporated silicon compounds into their structure, their bodies might have been naturally prone to turning into rock when they died, without requiring the usual fossilization process. They might have been, in a sense, living stone. The energetic requirements of such massive creatures would have been staggering. A human body requires about 2,000 calories per day to function, energy that comes from food. A giant 100 times taller would not require 100 times as many calories, but rather 1,000,000 times as many, because of the square cube law. Such a creature would need to consume an enormous amount of food every single day, more than seems plausible. Unless, again, the giants did not get their energy primarily from food. What if they could absorb energy directly from sunlight, like plants? What if they drew power from the Earth itself, tapping into geothermal energy or some other source we do not recognize? Many ancient myths describe the giants as children of the Earth, born from the ground, sustained by the ground. The Greek Titans were literally earthborn, the offspring of Gaia, the Earth goddess. What if this is not metaphor, but description? A memory that the giants were connected to the Earth in ways that allowed them to draw sustenance directly from the planet, making them independent of the food chain that limits the size of all other creatures. If the giants built a civilization, they must have had technology. The question is what kind of technology, and whether we can still detect traces of it in the world today. When we think of advanced technology, we usually imagine electronics, computers, machines made of metal and plastic, devices that require electricity and precision manufacturing. But this is technology as we have developed it, suited to our size and our capabilities. The giants, being so much larger, would have developed technology suited to their scale. Their tools would have been massive. Their machines would have been built on scales that make our largest construction equipment look like toys. More importantly, their technology might have been based on entirely different principles than ours, using materials and energy sources that we do not recognize as technological because they look natural to us. Consider the megalithic structures we discussed earlier, the massive stones cut and placed with impossible precision. What if these stones were not shaped by tools in the way we understand tools, but rather by some kind of force or energy that could manipulate stone directly? There are hints in ancient texts and legends of such capabilities. The Bible speaks of the walls of Jericho falling at the sound of trumpets, suggesting that sound or vibration could affect stone. The ancient Egyptians had legends of priests who could move stone blocks by striking them with rods and chanting, as if sound could reduce the weight of the stones or make them levitate. Modern science has discovered acoustic levitation, a real phenomenon where intense sound waves can suspend small objects in mid-air by creating pressure waves that counteract gravity. What if the giants had mastered this principle on a much larger scale, using sound or vibration to manipulate massive stones, making them easy to move and position? The vitrified stones, those that show signs of having been melted, could be evidence of another technology, perhaps something like a directed energy beam that could heat rock to its melting point in a focused area, allowing it to be shaped like clay before it cooled. The crystals found in many caves and mountains might also be technological artifacts rather than natural formations. Crystals have remarkable properties. They can store information, as we use quartz crystals to store data in computers. They can generate electricity when pressure is applied, a phenomenon called piezoelectricity. They can focus and amplify electromagnetic waves. What if the giant crystals found in places like the Cave of Crystals are not merely beautiful geological formations, but rather functional devices, memory storage or power systems that were part of the giant civilization's technology? The Cave of Crystals in Mexico contains selenite crystals up to 36 feet long and several feet in diameter. These crystals grew in a cave filled with mineral-rich water kept at a constant temperature for hundreds of thousands of years, according to geological analysis. But that timeline assumes the crystals grew naturally at the slow pace we observe in laboratory conditions. What if they were grown deliberately, cultivated like crops, using techniques that accelerated the growth process? The cave environment, with its constant heat and mineral-rich water, would have been ideal for such cultivation. When the giants died and their civilization fell, the systems maintaining the cave would have failed, the water would have gradually drained away, and the crystals would have been left behind inert but intact, waiting in the dark for thousands of years until humans accidentally rediscovered them. The power systems of the giant civilization would have been as massive as everything else about them. They could not have relied on small energy sources like fire or muscle power. They would have needed something much larger, much more powerful. What if they used geothermal energy, tapping into the heat of the Earth's interior? Volcanic areas, which are dangerous to us, might have been their power plants, places where the natural heat of the Earth could be harnessed and converted to usable energy. Many ancient sacred sites are located near volcanoes or hot springs. The Greeks built the Oracle of Delphi on a volcanic vent that emitted gases which put the priestess into a trance state. The Maori of New Zealand hold geothermal areas as sacred. The Yellowstone caldera in North America, with its geysers and hot springs, was sacred to many Native American tribes. What if these places were sacred not because of superstition, but because they were the power centers of the giant civilization, and the humans who came after recognized them as places of power even if they no longer understood what that power was or how to use it? There is also the question of communication. A civilization spread across continents would have needed ways to communicate over long distances. We use radio waves and satellite networks. What did the giants use? One possibility is that they used the Earth itself as a communication medium, sending signals through the rock and ground that could be detected by receivers elsewhere. The Earth conducts electricity and can carry vibrations for long distances. The giants, with their massive size and their connection to the Earth, might have been able to generate and detect these signals naturally, using their bodies as transmitters and receivers. This would explain the legends of giants being able to sense things at great distances, of knowing when other giants were in trouble or when danger was approaching. It was not magic or supernatural ability, but rather a biological capability enhanced by technology, a natural communication system that we have lost because we are no longer the right size or shape to use it. In many ancient texts, there are references to beings called watchers, entities who observe humanity but do not directly interfere. The Book of Enoch devotes considerable attention to the watchers, describing them as angels who descended to earth, took human wives, and fathered the Nephilim giants. These watchers taught humans forbidden knowledge, including the secrets of metallurgy, weapons, cosmetics, astrology, and sorcery. Eventually, the watchers were punished by God for their transgression, bound and imprisoned until the day of judgment. But what if the watchers were not angels, but rather the last survivors of the giant civilization, beings who survived the catastrophe, and watched as humanity emerged from the ruins to build a new world. What if the knowledge they taught was not forbidden divine secrets, but rather remnants of the advanced technology their civilization had possessed? Skills that seemed like magic to primitive humans, but were actually science. The idea of watchers appears in other traditions as well, though not always by that name. In Greek mythology, Prometheus was a titan who gave fire to humanity, teaching them how to use it despite Zeus's prohibition. For this act, Prometheus was punished, chained to a rock where an eagle ate his liver every day, only for it to regenerate each night in an eternal torment. This story is usually interpreted as a metaphor for the price of knowledge. But what if it is a memory of an actual event? What if Prometheus was one of the surviving giants who tried to help humanity by sharing knowledge from the fallen civilization? The liver-eating eagle could be a symbolic representation of a punishment device or process, something that caused continuous pain and prevented escape. The rock to which Prometheus was chained might be the mountain into which his body had been partially transformed, a fate he could not escape because it was his own flesh turning to stone. There are also traditions of hidden masters or secret guardians who watch over humanity from remote locations. Theosophy speaks of the Mahatmas, advanced beings living in hidden retreats in the Himalayas, who guide human evolution from behind the scenes. Tibetan Buddhism speaks of Shambhala, a hidden kingdom in the mountains where enlightened beings preserve ancient wisdom. Native American traditions speak of the Star People, beings who live in the high places and occasionally come down to teach or warn. What if all these traditions are memories or knowledge of the last giants? Beings who retreated to the mountains not because they chose isolation, but because they were physically becoming the mountains, their bodies slowly petrifying, leaving them immobile but still conscious, still able to observe, still able to occasionally communicate with the humans who sought them out. This raises a disturbing possibility. If the transformation from living being to mountain was a gradual process, then the giants would have experienced it consciously. Imagine realizing that your body is turning to stone, that you can no longer move, that your flesh is becoming rock, but your mind remains active, trapped in a prison of stone. Years would pass, then decades, then centuries. Your body would become indistinguishable from the mountain, but inside, your consciousness would remain, unable to move, unable to communicate except perhaps through the rarest of chances when a human sensitive enough comes near. This would explain the legends of spirits in the mountains, of voices heard in the wind, of the sense that the mountains are alive and aware. They are not metaphors. They are the literal truth. The mountains are alive, or at least the consciousness of the giants who became them remains somehow active, trapped in stone, aware but unable to act, watching humanity build civilizations on their bodies, watching time pass in a nightmare of eternal immobility. Some people who spend significant time in the mountains report experiences that might support this idea. They describe feelings of presence, sensations of being watched, moments when the mountain seems to communicate with them. These experiences are usually dismissed as subjective, as the result of isolation, altitude, or psychological projection. But what if they are real? What if sensitive individuals can actually detect the consciousness of the giants, can feel their awareness, can even receive messages or impressions from them? The Australian Aborigines speak of song lines, paths across the land that are also songs, ways of navigating by singing the landscape. They say the land itself sings, that every feature has a song, that by learning the songs you learn the land. What if this is literally true? What if the land sings because it is alive, because it contains the consciousness of the beings who became it, and their thoughts and memories create patterns that can be detected and expressed as songs? Sometimes the most convincing evidence is the evidence we see every day but never really notice because we have been taught to interpret it in a specific way. Language itself may preserve memories of the truth about mountains. In English, we speak of mountain ranges, using the same word we use for the range of animals' territory or the range of motion of a joint. We describe mountains as having spines and ribs, heads and feet, shoulders and necks. We say they have faces, that they tower over us, that they loom. These are all anthropomorphic terms, words we use to describe living things or things that resemble living things. Why do we use such language for mountains if mountains are just inert piles of rock? The answer is that the language preserves a memory of what mountains actually are, and we use these terms unconsciously because on some deep level we recognize the truth even though our conscious minds have forgotten it. Many mountains have names that reference giants or beings of great size. Mount Olympus, home of the Greek gods, means the high place, but the gods who lived there were not normal humans. They were beings of immense power and, in many depictions, immense size. Mount Fuji in Japan is considered sacred, the home of kami, spirits that are often depicted as giants. The Andes Mountains take their name from the Anti, the people who lived on the eastern slopes, but the Inca believed these mountains were home to Apus, mountain gods who protected the people. The Himalayas mean abode of snow, but the people who live in their shadow have countless legends of yetis and other giant creatures that inhabit the high places. Is it coincidence that mountains around the world are associated with giants and gods? Or is it preserved memory, cultural knowledge passed down through generations, that mountains are the bodies of beings that were once like gods in their power? Place names often encode information that has been forgotten but not erased. In the United States, there are dozens of places with names like Giant's Cave, Giant Springs, Giant Rock, Giant's Causeway. These names were given by European settlers who heard stories from Native Americans about giants who had lived in these places. The settlers did not necessarily believe the stories, but they preserved them in the place names. In Europe, there are countless locations named after giants. Giant's Causeway in Ireland, a formation of interlocking basalt columns that legend says was built by the giant Finn McCool. Giant's Grave in Sardinia, a type of megalithic tomb that was believed to be the actual burial place of giants. Riesengebirge, the giant mountains on the border of Poland and the Czech Republic. These names are not accidental. They reflect genuine traditions and beliefs about these places, traditions that may be based on actual knowledge of what these places represent. Archaeological sites sometimes contain artifacts that seem out of place, objects that are too large or too sophisticated for the culture to which they are attributed. These artifacts are usually explained away or simply ignored because they do not fit the established narrative. In Ecuador, there is a collection of enormous stone artifacts that were supposedly found in caves in the Amazon region in the 1990s. These include stone tools and implements that are far too large for human hands, as if designed for beings of much greater size. The artifacts include hammers, axes, and other tools with handles over 2 feet long and heads weighing dozens of pounds. For a normal human, such tools would be unwieldy and impractical. For a giant, they would be proportionate. Mainstream archaeology has largely ignored these artifacts, suggesting they are hoaxes or misidentified natural formations, but no one has provided a satisfactory explanation for why someone would create such elaborate hoaxes or how natural processes would create objects with such clearly artificial shapes. Giant footprints have been reported from various locations around the world. In South Africa, there is a granite outcrop that contains what appears to be a footprint over 4 feet long, pressed into solid rock. The print shows clear toe marks and the shape of a human foot, just greatly enlarged. Geologists who have examined it say the rock is over 200 million years old, which would make the footprint impossible since humans did not exist that long ago. The usual explanation is that it is a natural formation that coincidentally resembles a footprint, or that it was carved in recent times as a hoax, but neither explanation is entirely satisfactory. Natural formations do not usually show such clear anatomical detail, and a carving would show tool marks and signs of artificial work, which this print does not. What if it is exactly what it appears to be? A footprint left by a giant who stepped on this rock when it was soft mud, millions of years before humans evolved, evidence that the giants existed in an age vastly older than our civilization. The story of the giants and their transformation into mountains may not be purely earthly. Many ancient traditions speak of the giants as having come from the stars, as being connected to celestial beings or cosmic forces. The Book of Enoch says that the Watchers descended from heaven to earth. Native American legends often speak of the star people who came down from the sky. Hindu texts describe the Deva and Asura, gods and demons who fought great wars in the heavens before some of them came to earth. Greek mythology tells of the Titans being the children of Uranus, the sky, and Gaia, the earth, making them literally the offspring of cosmic and terrestrial forces. What if these stories are not metaphorical but historical, memories of a time when beings from elsewhere in the universe came to Earth and established the civilization whose remains we now call mountains? The idea of ancient astronauts is not new. Researchers like Erich von Däniken have argued for decades that many ancient structures and myths can be explained by visits from extraterrestrial beings who are mistaken for gods by primitive humans. This theory has been heavily criticized and largely rejected by mainstream academia, but it persists because it offers explanations for genuinely puzzling evidence that conventional theories struggle with. If we add the giants to this equation, the picture becomes even more interesting. What if the giants were the ancient astronauts, or at least some of them were? Beings from another world, adapted to different gravity and different conditions, would naturally be different in size and capabilities from native Earth life. They would have technology far beyond anything humans possessed. They would seem like gods. Consider the conditions that would exist on a planet with lower gravity than Earth. Creatures evolving there would naturally grow larger because they would not be constrained by the same weight limitations that restrict size on Earth. If beings from such a world came to Earth, they would experience higher gravity than they were accustomed to, but they might still be viable, especially if they had technology to help them adapt. Over time, if they remained on Earth for many generations, the higher gravity might cause problems. Their bones might become stressed. Their hearts might struggle to pump blood against the greater gravitational pull. They might develop health problems that gradually weaken them. If a catastrophe then struck, they might not have been able to survive conditions that would have been merely challenging for Earth-adapted creatures. Their civilization would have fallen not just because of the cosmic impact and the resulting climate changes, but because they were already weakened, already struggling to survive in an environment that was not quite right for their biology. The transformation of their bodies into stone might also have a cosmic dimension. Some researchers have proposed that there are energies or forces in the universe that we do not yet understand, forces that can affect matter in ways that seem impossible according to current physics. If the giants came from a place where these forces were different, their bodies might have been structured in ways that made them susceptible to petrifaction when those forces changed. The catastrophe 12,000 years ago might have been not just a physical impact, but also a shift in cosmic energies, a change in the fundamental forces affecting Earth. The giant, being from elsewhere, would have been more sensitive to this shift than native Earth life. Their bodies would have begun to crystallize, to turn to stone, as the energies they depended on were altered or removed. They would have literally become part of the Earth, their cosmic origins erased, their bodies transformed into terrestrial rock. So there is another possibility that connects to quantum physics and the nature of reality itself. Modern physics tells us that matter and energy are interchangeable, that the solid objects we see are actually mostly empty space with tiny particles held together by forces, that the universe is far stranger and more fluid than our senses tell us. What if the giants existed in a state that was not quite physical as we understand physical, a state where the boundaries between matter and energy were more fluid? They could interact with the physical world, could build structures and affect matter, but they were not entirely bound by physical laws. When the catastrophe struck, it might have disrupted whatever process allowed them to maintain this state. They would have collapsed into purely physical matter. their bodies becoming stone not through gradual fossilization, but through instantaneous transformation as the energy sustaining their form dissipated. This would explain why mountains seem to have the structure of bodies but are made of rock rather than flesh and bone. They never had flesh and bone in the way we understand it. They were always something in between, something that could be either matter or energy depending on conditions, and when conditions changed, they became locked into the matter state permanently. Throughout history, humans have had a complex relationship with mountains. We revere them, fear them, worship them, climb them, mine them, live on them. This relationship takes on new dimensions if we understand that mountains are the remains of beings that once lived. In many cultures, mountains are sacred, places where gods dwell or where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds is thin. People build temples on mountains, go on pilgrimages to mountain shrines, seek visions and enlightenment in the high places. This reverence makes sense if mountains are literally the bodies of powerful beings. We are walking on them, living on them, drawing resources from them. On some level, consciously or unconsciously, we recognize what they are, and we respond with the respect and awe that one would show to the dead, especially to the dead who were once far greater than us. But we also exploit mountains. We mine them for metals and minerals, blast tunnels through them, carve roads into their flanks, remove their tops to access coal and other resources beneath. We treat them as obstacles to be overcome or resources to be consumed. This behavior would be deeply disturbing if we fully accepted that mountains are the remains of conscious beings. It would be like mining the pyramids of Egypt or digging up cemeteries for raw materials. Yet we do it without hesitation, because our official understanding of mountains is that they are just rock, inert and unconscious, with no more significance than any other geological formation. This understanding allows us to use mountains without guilt, without acknowledging what we are really doing. But what if that understanding is wrong? What if every mine is a wound, every tunnel a violation, every removed mountaintop an act of desecration? Some cultures have maintained a more respectful relationship with mountains. The Maori of New Zealand regard mountains as ancestors, as physical manifestations of beings from the dreamtime who were turned to stone. They do not climb certain peaks because doing so would be disrespectful to the ancestors. They perform ceremonies before undertaking any activity that might disturb a mountain. This attitude is often dismissed by Western cultures as primitive animism, a pre-scientific belief system that attributes consciousness to inanimate objects. But what if the Maori are right? What if their traditions have preserved the truth that Western science has forgotten, that mountains are indeed ancestors, beings that once lived and should be treated with appropriate respect? The practice of mountain climbing itself becomes questionable under this new understanding. Every year, thousands of people attempt to climb famous peaks like Everest, Kilimanjaro, Denali. They speak of conquering the mountain, of defeating it, of planting flags on its summit, as if claiming victory in a battle. This language reveals an adversarial relationship, as if the mountain is an enemy to be overcome. But if the mountain is a body, then climbers are crawling over a corpse, and the summit they reach is perhaps the head or the highest point of the chest. The difficulties of climbing, the avalanches and rock falls and sudden storms, take on a different character. Are they just natural hazards? Or are they the mountain's response to being disturbed? The last reflexive reactions of a consciousness that cannot fully express itself but can still affect the physical conditions around it. The many deaths that occur on high peaks might not be just accidents or the result of human error, but rather the mountain defending itself the only way it can by creating conditions that drive away or eliminate those who violate it. There is also the question of what we owe to the giants, if indeed that is what mountains are. Do we have any obligation to them? Any duty to respect their remains or honour their memory? They are dead, after all, or transformed beyond any possibility of return. They cannot demand respect or punish disrespect in any direct way. But ethics and morality are not just about reciprocity or fear of punishment. They are about how we choose to act, about what kind of beings we want to be. If we accept that mountains are the remains of a civilization that once possessed knowledge and power far beyond ours, then treating those remains with respect seems like the minimum decency we can offer. It means being more careful about how we use mountain resources, more thoughtful about where and how we build on mountains, more conscious of the fact that we are living on and with the physical remnants of beings that deserve our acknowledgement and perhaps our gratitude for providing the very landscape that supports us. The theory that mountains are the bones of dead giants faces fierce resistance from the scientific establishment, and it is worth examining why. Science is supposed to be about following evidence wherever it leads, about questioning assumptions and testing new ideas. But in practice, science is a human institution, subject to all the limitations and biases that affect any human endeavor. Scientists are trained in specific paradigms, frameworks for understanding the world that define what questions are worth asking and what answers are acceptable. When a theory falls outside the accepted paradigm, it faces enormous hurdles, regardless of what evidence supports it. Thomas Kuhn described this process in his book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, showing how scientific progress does not occur through smooth accumulation of knowledge, but rather through periodic revolutionary shifts when old paradigms are overthrown and replaced by new ones. But these revolutions are always resisted by the defenders of the old paradigm, who have built their careers and reputations on the theories being challenged. The mountains as bones theory would require overturning fundamental assumptions in multiple fields: geology, paleontology, archaeology, anthropology, evolutionary biology. It would mean admitting that the geological theory of mountain formation, developed over 2 centuries and supported by countless observations and experiments, is incomplete or wrong in some fundamental way. It would mean acknowledging that creatures of impossible size once existed, that the fossil record is missing major components, that human history is far shorter than we thought relative to the history of civilization on Earth. The institutional investment in current theories is enormous. Textbooks would need to be rewritten. Research programs would need to be redirected. Experts would need to admit that they do not actually understand things they have been teaching with confidence for decades. This creates powerful psychological and social pressure to reject any evidence that threatens the established paradigm. There is also the problem of specialization. Modern science is so divided into narrow specializations that no one has expertise in all the areas relevant to the mountains as bones theory. A geologist knows rocks but not biology. A biologist knows living creatures but not paleontology. A paleontologist knows fossils but not mythology. An anthropologist knows human cultures but not physics. Each specialist can find reasons within their narrow fields to reject the parts of the theory that touch on their specialty, but no one has the breadth of knowledge to see how all the pieces fit together. And scientists are trained not to trust evidence from outside their field. The geologist will not accept anatomical analysis of mountain structure because anatomy is not geology. A biologist will not accept mineralogical evidence of fossilized tissue because mineralogy is not biology. This compartmentalization prevents the kind of integrative thinking that the mountains as bones theory requires. There is also simple incredulity. The idea that mountains are dead giants sounds absurd on its face, like something from a fairy tale or fantasy novel, not like serious science. Scientists pride themselves on being rational, on not being swayed by fantastical ideas. When presented with a theory that sounds absurd, the natural response is to reject it without serious examination, to assume that there must be some simple explanation for any evidence that seems to support it. This is not necessarily wrong. Most absurd-sounding ideas really are absurd, and a healthy skepticism prevents science from wasting time on nonsense. But occasionally, an absurd-sounding idea turns out to be true. The Earth orbiting the Sun sounded absurd when first proposed. Germs causing disease sounded absurd. Continental drift sounded absurd. Quantum mechanics sounds absurd even to people who work with it every day. The challenge is to distinguish between absurd ideas that are wrong and absurd ideas that are true but unfamiliar. This requires actually examining the evidence, being willing to consider possibilities that violate common sense, having the intellectual courage to follow logic even when it leads to uncomfortable conclusions. Perhaps the deepest reason for resistance is existential. If mountains are the remains of dead giants, then humanity is not the pinnacle of creation, not the most advanced beings that have ever existed on Earth. We are newcomers, children playing in the ruins of something far greater than ourselves. Our achievements, which seem so impressive to us, are nothing compared to what came before. Our cities are toys compared to the cities of the giants. Our technology is primitive compared to what they possessed. Our understanding of the universe is shallow compared to the knowledge they had. This realization would be humbling, even humiliating. It would force us to reconsider our place in the cosmos, to acknowledge that we are not special, not chosen, not the inevitable endpoint of evolution or divine creation. We are just one more species on a planet that has hosted countless species, and we exist in the shadow of beings that were once as far above us as we are above insects. This is a difficult truth to accept, and the human tendency is to reject difficult truths in favor of comfortable illusions. If we accept, even hypothetically, that mountains are the remains of a dead civilization of giants, the implications ripple outward to affect almost every aspect of how we understand the world and our place in it. First and most obviously, it means that history as we understand it is wrong, not just slightly wrong, but fundamentally wrong. Human civilization did not arise spontaneously from primitive hunter-gatherers who slowly developed agriculture and writing and technology over thousands of years. Instead, human civilization arose in the ruins of an earlier, far more advanced civilization, and much of what we credit ourselves with inventing may actually be rediscovery of knowledge that once existed. The megalithic structures, the advanced astronomical knowledge of ancient cultures, the sophisticated mathematics encoded in ancient buildings. All these could be remnants or memories of what the giants knew, passed down through oral traditions or through artifacts that humans found and tried to understand and replicate. This would explain some of the puzzling patterns in the development of human civilization. Why did agriculture and writing and urban civilization appear suddenly and independently in multiple locations around the world at approximately the same time, around 10 to 12,000 years ago? The traditional answer is that climate changes at the end of the Ice Age made these developments possible, and that humans in different locations independently came up with similar solutions. But the timing is suspiciously coincident with the proposed date of the catastrophe that destroyed the giants. What if agriculture and civilization did not develop independently, but were rather taught to humans by the surviving giants, or discovered by humans exploring the ruins and finding preserved knowledge? The sudden appearance of sophisticated culture would then make more sense as the transmission of existing knowledge rather than the independent invention of new knowledge. It would also change how we think about the future. If a civilization as advanced as the giants could be completely destroyed, leaving almost no trace except their bodies turned to stone, then our civilization is equally vulnerable. We like to think that we are secure, that our knowledge is permanently recorded, that even if something catastrophic happened, future generations could rebuild quickly using the information we have preserved. But the giant civilization presumably thought the same thing, and it did not save them. Their cities are gone. Their books, if they had books, are gone. Their machines are gone or unrecognizable. All that remains are their bodies and the faint traces of their knowledge encoded in myths and megalithic structures. If the same thing happened to us, If a cosmic impact or some other catastrophe struck tomorrow, would future archaeologists be able to figure out what we were and what we knew? Or would they wander among the ruins of our cities, seeing only strange rock formations, never imagining that these had once been buildings full of living, thinking beings? The implications extend to religion and philosophy as well. Most religions have creation stories that place humans at the center of divine attention, as the purpose of creation or the beloved children of God or gods. If giants existed first, if they were the original civilization on Earth, or the first civilization to come to Earth from elsewhere, then humans are not the primary focus of cosmic attention. We are secondary, perhaps even accidental, beings who emerged after the main story had already played out. This does not necessarily negate religion, but it requires reimagining it. Perhaps the giants were the first creation, and when they fell, humans were created as a second attempt, smaller and weaker but hopefully more resilient. Perhaps the gods who appear in human religions were actually the giants, and when they died they became objects of worship for the humans who came after, who remembered them but did not understand what they had been. Perhaps the whole structure of divine hierarchy, with powerful gods and lesser beings and humans at the bottom, reflects a memory of when the giants were alive and humans were indeed lesser beings under their rule. There are also implications for environmental policy and ethics. If mountains are bodies, then the earth itself is in some sense a graveyard, the final resting place of beings who deserve respect. This should affect how we treat the environment, how we extract resources, how we decide what areas to protect and what areas to develop. Currently, we protect areas because of their beauty, or their biodiversity, or their importance to human recreation and culture. But if an area is sacred because it is literally the body of a dead giant, that adds another dimension to its value, one that transcends human utility. It suggests that some places should be off limits not because we need them for parks or wildlife habitat, but because they are monuments to beings that came before us, and we have no right to disturb them. This is a difficult argument to make in a world focused on economic development and resource exploitation, but it is one that becomes necessary if we take seriously the possibility that the landscape is not just scenery, but rather a cemetery on a planetary scale. Where do we go from here? If the mountains as bones theory is true, or even if it is only possibly true, how should that change how we live and what we do? For most people, the answer might be nothing. They will continue to live their lives, climb mountains for recreation, mine them for resources, build on them when necessary, all without thinking about what mountains might actually be. Cognitive dissonance allows humans to simultaneously hold contradictory beliefs, to know something intellectually while not really accepting it emotionally or changing behavior based on it. We know that factory farming causes animal suffering, yet we eat meat. We know that fossil fuels are changing the climate, yet we drive cars. We know that mountains might be the bodies of giants, yet we will continue to treat them as geological formations because that is easier and more convenient than confronting the implications. For some people, for those who have truly heard this story and felt its truth resonating in their bones, something must change. It might start with simple things. Being more conscious when hiking in the mountains, feeling the presence of the giant beneath your feet, thanking it for allowing you to walk on its body, opposing destructive mining or development projects not just because of environmental impact, but because of respect for the being whose body would be violated, speaking out about the theory, sharing it with others, even knowing that most will dismiss it because truth deserves to be spoken even when it is unwelcome. These are small acts, but they matter. They represent a shift in consciousness, a movement from seeing the earth as dead matter to be used towards seeing it as a living or once living presence to be honored. To researchers and scientists, the challenge is to take the theory seriously enough to test it rigorously. This means looking at mountains with fresh eyes, measuring them in ways that could confirm or deny anatomical structures, analyzing rock composition for evidence of biological origin, examining caves and tunnels for patterns consistent with vascular or neural systems. It means being willing to publish findings even if they contradict accepted theories, being willing to risk professional reputation for the sake of truth. It means collaborating across disciplines, bringing together geologists and biologists and anthropologists and physicists to look at the same evidence from multiple perspectives. This kind of work is difficult and often unrewarded in the current academic system, but it is necessary if we are ever to move beyond speculation and into genuine knowledge. For society as a whole, accepting the mountains as bones theory would require a massive shift in worldview, comparable to the shift from geocentric to heliocentric cosmology, or from creationism to evolution. It would take generations for such a shift to complete, for the new understanding to work its way into popular consciousness, into textbooks, into the basic assumptions that people use to navigate the world. But these shifts do happen. Ideas that once seemed absurd become accepted. Knowledge that was suppressed or ignored becomes mainstream. The process is slow and painful, but it is possible. The first step is simply acknowledging that the theory exists, that it is based on real evidence, that it deserves consideration even if that consideration ultimately leads to rejection. Truth is resilient. If the mountains as bones theory is true, then eventually, somehow, that truth will be recognized. The only question is how long it will take and how much resistance it will face along the way. Beyond the scientific and philosophical implications, there is something deeply personal about the mountains as bones theory. It changes how it feels to be in the mountains, to stand at the base of a great peak and look up at its summit, to walk through a mountain pass or climb to a high ridge. When you understand that the rock beneath your feet might be the bones of a being that once lived and thought and felt, the mountain becomes less alien, less other. It becomes a companion in a strange way, a fellow creature that has also existed in this universe, that has also struggled and failed and died. There is a kinship there, a connection across the vast gulf of time and form. The mountain is not your enemy, not an obstacle to overcome or a resource to exploit. It is a witness to time, a survivor in its own way, a repository of stories that it cannot tell but that exist in its form and structure for those who learn to read them. Many people report feeling a sense of peace in the mountains, a release from the stress and noise of modern life. There is a silence in high places that is not just the absence of sound but something deeper, something that allows the mind to quiet and the spirit to expand. If the mountains are the bodies of giants, then perhaps this feeling is not just psychological but actual, the result of being in the presence of consciousness that is no longer confined to thought and action, but has expanded into the stillness of stone. The giants, unable to move or speak, have become pure awareness, and when we enter their domain, we touch that awareness. We feel its calm and its depth. We cannot communicate with them in words, but we can share presence. And that sharing is what gives mountains their sacred quality, what makes them places of pilgrimage and vision questing and spiritual retreat. There is also grief. If the mountains are the remains of beings that once lived, then they represent a loss, a tragedy on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. An entire civilization destroyed, millions or billions of beings dead, knowledge accumulated over millennia lost forever, beauty and wonder erased in a single catastrophic event. When we look at mountains with this understanding, we are looking at a monument to that loss, a marker of absence. The world is poorer for the disappearance of the giants, not because they could have given us things or taught us things, but simply because diversity is valuable, because the existence of other kinds of consciousness enriches the universe, because a world with only one kind of sentient being is lonelier than a world with many kinds. We cannot bring the giants back, but we can mourn them, and mourning is important. It acknowledges loss, honors what existed, and reminds us that nothing lasts forever, that even the greatest civilizations fall. that impermanence is the nature of all things. But mourning is not the end of the story. After grief comes acceptance, and after acceptance comes the question of what we do with what remains. The giants left us their bodies, transformed into mountains, and those mountains support ecosystems, provide water, create weather patterns, shape climate. They are not just passive monuments, but active participants in the living world. In death, the giants continue to sustain life, though not in the form they once knew. There is a lesson there about transformation, about how endings can become beginnings, about how even the worst catastrophe eventually gives way to new growth and new possibilities. We live in the world the giants unintentionally created by dying. We owe them recognition, respect, and gratitude. And we owe it to ourselves to learn from their fate, to understand that power and knowledge are not enough to guarantee survival, that humility before the forces of the universe is wisdom, not weakness. Even if we accept the mountains as bones theory, enormous questions remain unanswered. Perhaps the biggest is simply, what were they? We have called them giants, but that word covers a multitude of possibilities. Were they essentially human, just scaled up in size? Or were they something more alien, with different biology, different psychology, different values and motivations? Did they think like we think, feel like we feel? Or was their consciousness so different from ours that we could never truly understand it, even if we could somehow communicate with them? The myths give us hints, describing the giants variously as wise and foolish, benevolent and cruel, but myths are filtered through human interpretation, shaped by human concerns. We cannot trust them to tell us what the giants were really like. We also do not know how long they existed. Was their civilization thousands of years old, millions of years old, billions of years old? Did they evolve on Earth or come from elsewhere? Were there multiple species or types of giants, or were they all one kind? The fossil record gives us no answers because we do not know how to identify their remains as biological rather than geological. The myths speak of different types of giants in different cultures: titans and cyclopes in Greece, frost giants and fire giants in Norse mythology, different clans and families in Native American legends. Were these actual distinctions, different subspecies or ethnic groups among the giants? Or were they just narrative devices, ways for storytellers to create variety and conflict in their tales? We do not know what destroyed them beyond the general outlines of a catastrophic event. Was it a comet impact, as some researchers suggest? Was it a supervolcano eruption? Was it a sudden shift in the Earth's axis or magnetic field? Was it something from space, a burst of radiation, or a gravitational anomaly? Was it even a natural event, or could it have been deliberate, the result of a war or an experiment that went wrong? The evidence is ambiguous, consistent with multiple scenarios. The Young Dryas impact hypothesis is compelling but not proven. The ice core data shows a sudden climate shift but not necessarily its cause. The myths speak of war between gods and giants, of cosmic battles, of divine punishment, all of which could be metaphorical descriptions of natural events, or could be literal history of conflicts we cannot imagine. We do not know if any giants still exist in some form beyond the mountains. Are there survivors in hiding, reduced to small numbers and living in remote areas where humans never go? Are there bases or shelters deep underground where giants retreated and might still persist in suspended animation or some other form? Are there giants elsewhere in the solar system or the galaxy, relatives of those who came to Earth, who might someday return to find what became of their expedition or colony? These questions sound like science fiction, but if we have already accepted that mountains are the bodies of a dead civilization, then we have stepped beyond the boundaries of conventional thinking, and we must follow the logic wherever it leads, even into territory that seems fantastical. Throughout this exploration, we have repeatedly turned to mythology and ancient legends for insight. This is not because myths are reliable historical records. They are not. but because they preserve memory in a way that historical records sometimes do not. Historical records document what people knew and could prove at the time they were written. Myths preserve what people experienced and believed, even when they could not explain or prove it. A historical record says in year X event Y happened. A myth says in ancient times there were giants and they became the mountains. The historical record is more precise but more limited. The myth is vaguer, but potentially encompasses deeper truths that historical records miss because the recorders did not understand what they were seeing. The fact that giant myths appear in virtually every culture worldwide is significant. It suggests either that giants actually existed and were encountered by human ancestors everywhere, or that the human mind has some deep tendency to imagine giants, perhaps because seeing large animals or large geological formations triggers a pattern recognition system that interprets them as giant humanoids. The psychological explanation cannot be entirely dismissed. Humans do tend to anthropomorphize, to see faces in clouds and humanoid shapes in random patterns. But the consistency of the myths is striking. If each culture independently invented giant stories from scratch, we would expect more variation in the details. Instead, we see repeated patterns. Giants who were powerful and often wise, who taught humans various skills, who built massive structures, who were eventually destroyed in a catastrophe involving gods or cosmic forces. These common elements suggest a common source, either an actual historical reality or at minimum a shared body of very ancient myths that spread to different cultures before they separated. Some researchers have attempted to trace myth origins, looking for the oldest versions of stories to see how they changed over time. This work is difficult because oral traditions often predate written records by thousands of years, and we can only guess at what the earliest versions might have said, but there are tantalizing hints. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest written documents in existence, describes kings who ruled before a great flood and who had reigns lasting thousands or tens of thousands of years. This is usually interpreted as mythological exaggeration, but what if it is literal? What if these were giant kings whose lifespans actually were that long, either because of their biology or because of their technology? The flood that ended their rule would then be the same catastrophe that killed the giants and turned their bodies to mountains. After the flood, the king list describes normal human rulers with normal lifespans. This could be the transition point, the moment when giants ceased to rule and humans took over, building their own civilizations on the ruins of what came before. Mythology also preserves technical knowledge in symbolic form. The story of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humans is usually read as a metaphor for the acquisition of technology. But what if it is more specific? What if fire represents a particular technology, perhaps energy generation or metallurgy, that the giants possessed and that humans learned by observing or being taught by a renegade giant? The story of Daedalus and Icarus, the craftsman who built wings to fly but whose son flew too close to the sun and fell, could be a memory of actual flight technology that existed but was dangerous and eventually failed. The story of Atlantis, the advanced civilization that sank beneath the waves in a single day and night, could be a memory of a giant city that was destroyed in the catastrophe. These stories persist not because people enjoy fiction, although they do, but because they encode real events that were so important that they had to be preserved, even if the only way to preserve them was through symbolic narratives that could be remembered and retold across generations. To take the mountains as bones theory seriously, we need an alternative understanding of geology, a framework that can accommodate the idea that at least some geological formations are biological in origin. This does not mean rejecting all of mainstream geology. Plate tectonics is real, erosion is real, volcanic activity is real, but these processes might be operating on and interacting with structures that have a different origin than currently assumed. Imagine a giant body lying on the ground covered by sediment from floods and volcanic eruptions. Over time, tectonic forces might push that body upward, tilting it, folding it, breaking it. Erosion would wear away the softer tissues, leaving the harder bones exposed. Volcanic intrusions might push through the body, filling spaces with molten rock. The result would look like a mountain range created by purely geological processes, but the underlying structure would be biological. This hybrid model, biological structure modified by geological processes, can explain features that pure geology struggles with. It explains why mountain ranges have such regular structures, why they follow anatomical patterns, because they started as bodies and were then modified by natural forces. It explains the presence of minerals and crystals that seem out of place, because they originated as biological minerals and were then concentrated and transformed by geological processes. It explains the timing of mountain building, why many major ranges were uplifted or formed in the period after the catastrophe, because that is when the giant bodies were being buried and compressed and transformed. The forces that created the mountains were not purely tectonic, but rather a combination of biological structure providing the template and geological processes shaping and modifying that template. This alternative geology would also need to account for how biological material turns into rock on such a massive scale. Normal fossilization occurs when minerals in groundwater gradually replace organic material in buried bones and tissues, turning them to stone over thousands or millions of years. But this process works slowly and usually only preserves hard tissues like bones and shells. Soft tissues decay before they can fossilize, except in rare circumstances. For entire giant bodies, including soft tissues, to turn to stone would require something different, a faster or more complete mineralization process. One possibility is that the catastrophe itself created conditions that accelerated fossilization. If the bodies were buried under volcanic ash, which is rich in minerals, and if they were subjected to intense heat and pressure from subsequent tectonic activity, the mineralization could have occurred much more rapidly than normal. Another possibility, as mentioned earlier, is that the giants' biochemistry was different from ours, that their tissues already contained high levels of minerals that made them prone to petrification under the right conditions. There is also the question of how this alternative geology could be tested. What observations or experiments would support or refute the idea that mountains have biological origins? One approach would be detailed geochemical analysis of rock samples from mountains, looking for trace elements or isotope ratios that are characteristic of biological material. Biological calcium has a slightly different isotope ratio than geological calcium, for example. Biological silica is structured differently than geological silica at the molecular level. If mountains contain rock that shows biological signatures, that would be evidence supporting the theory. Another approach would be high-resolution ground-penetrating radar or seismic imaging of entire mountain ranges, looking for large-scale internal structures that match anatomical features. If we could image a complete skeleton inside a mountain, that would be compelling evidence. These technologies exist but have not been used for this purpose because no one is looking for giant skeletons. Simply asking the question and designing studies to answer it would be a major step forward. There is one more aspect of this theory that deserves attention, though it ventures into territory that science cannot easily address. If mountains are the bodies of giants and if some consciousness remains within them, then what do mountains dream? What is the subjective experience of a being trapped in stone for thousands of years, unable to move or communicate, aware but isolated? We have no way to know, of course. We cannot ask mountains questions and receive answers in any conventional sense. But we can speculate, and speculation sometimes leads to insight. Perhaps mountains do not dream in the way we dream, with images and narratives and emotions. Perhaps their consciousness is more like meditation, a pure awareness without content, simply existing and observing. The passage of time would be different for them. Days and seasons might blur together into a continuous flow. They would sense changes, the sun moving across the sky, the weather cycling through its patterns, the slow erosion of their bodies, the plants and animals that live on them, the humans who climb them or live on their slopes. Perhaps mountains dream of their past, of the time when they were alive and mobile, when they had agency and could shape their environment. These dreams would not be memories in the human sense, clear narratives of events that happened. They would be more like impressions, feelings, echoes of sensation and experience. The feeling of walking, of reaching, of building, the presence of others like themselves, the beauty of their cities, the satisfaction of their knowledge, the terror of the catastrophe, the pain of transformation, the gradual fading of self as their bodies turn to stone and their consciousness dispersed into the structure of the mountain. These are not happy dreams, but they are all they have, the only connection to what they once were. Perhaps mountains dream of the future, though they have no way to act to influence it. They watch humanity struggle and build and fight and fail, and they see patterns, cycles that repeat. They know how their own civilization ended, and they see the signs that human civilization might end the same way. They cannot warn us. They cannot intervene. All they can do is exist silent witnesses to history, hoping that perhaps someday humans will understand what they are, will learn the lesson that the mountains embody, will find a way to avoid the fate that befell the giants. This is a forlorn hope, but consciousness requires hope. Without it, existence would be unbearable, and the mountains would long ago have found some way to cease existing. That they remain suggests that they have not given up, that somewhere in the depths of the stone the spark of what they once were still persists, still holds on to the possibility that their sacrifice, their transformation into the landscape that supports life, has meaning and purpose. Of course, all of this is projection. We are imagining what mountains might experience, because we cannot help but imagine ourselves into the situation. But projection is not necessarily wrong. If consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe rather than an accident of biological complexity, then all things have some form of awareness, and the difference between human consciousness and mountain consciousness is one of degree and type rather than kind. Mountains might indeed dream, in their own fashion, and their dreams might leak out into the world in ways we perceive as intuition, a sense of place, as the spiritual presence that people feel in the high places. The evidence for this is subjective and anecdotal, exactly the kind of evidence that science dismisses, but that does not mean it is false. It means only that we do not yet have the tools or the framework to investigate it properly. Perhaps someday we will develop technologies that can detect consciousness in stone, that can communicate with mountains and hear their stories directly. Until then, we are left with wonder and speculation, which are valuable in their own right. As the first light of dawn touches the peaks and the darkness begins to retreat, we find ourselves at the end of this journey, though in truth it is only a beginning. We have walked through landscapes both physical and mental, exploring the possibility that the mountains we know so well are not what we thought they were, that beneath the familiar rock and ice lies a story so vast and so strange that it challenges everything we believe about the world and our place in it. We have looked at evidence from geology and mythology, from ancient structures and modern discoveries, from the shapes of continents and the chemistry of rocks. We have considered the implications for history and science, for religion and philosophy, for how we understand the past and how we approach the future. And throughout this exploration, we have held a question that cannot be answered definitively, but that demands to be asked. What if mountains are the bones of a dead civilization? The theory is extraordinary, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as the saying goes. Do we have such evidence? That depends on what we accept as evidence, and how we interpret it. There are facts that fit the theory. The anatomical shapes of mountain ranges, the precision of megalithic structures, the consistency of giant myths across cultures, the presence of minerals and formations that seem out of place in purely geological contexts. There are also facts that challenge the theory. The lack of clear fossil evidence, the difficulties with the scale involved, the absence of any accepted mechanism for how living beings could turn into entire mountains. The theory remains speculative, unproven, at best a hypothesis awaiting serious weight. But it is not absurd. It is not without foundation. It points to real mysteries and offers possible explanations that deserve consideration, even if that consideration ultimately leads to rejection. What matters most is not whether the theory is proven or disproven, but rather that it opens our minds to possibilities we have not considered, that it reminds us how much we do not know, how much we assume, how much we take for granted. We look at mountains and see geology because that is what we have been taught to see. But mountains could be many things. They could be monuments to the dead. They could be libraries of lost knowledge encoded in stone. They could be conscious beings trapped in matter, dreaming dreams we cannot imagine. They could be all of these things or none of them. The point is to remain open, to question, to wonder, to never assume that the first explanation we find is the only explanation or the true explanation. The universe is stranger and more complex than we can comprehend, and the natural world is full of mysteries that science has only begun to explore. The mountains have stood for thousands of years and will stand for thousands more. They are patient. They do not demand that we understand them, but they invite us to try, and in trying, we expand our own consciousness. We deepen our connection to the world. We become more fully human. As you close your eyes tonight and drift towards sleep, let the image of the mountains fill your mind. See them not as obstacles or scenery or resources, but as presences, as beings that have their own existence and their own stories. Feel the weight of time they carry, the epochs they have witnessed, the transformations they have undergone. Whether they are the bones of giants or merely stone, they are still extraordinary, still worthy of our awe and respect. Let the mountains become a lullaby, their permanence a comfort, their silence a space for your own thoughts to rest. Sleep now, and dream of a world where the boundaries between life and stone, between the possible and the impossible, are softer than we thought. Dream of giants walking the earth in ages past, of cities that touch the sky, of knowledge that we have forgotten but might someday remember. Dream of mountains breathing slowly in the night, of consciousness distributed through stone, of awareness that has no need of movement or speech. Dream of the earth as a living tapestry woven from all the beings that have ever existed, from the smallest microbe to the largest giant, all connected, all part of the same story. And when you wake, look at the world with fresh eyes, ready to see wonders you had overlooked, ready to find meaning in places you had dismissed, ready to embrace the mystery that surrounds us always, waiting patiently for us to notice it. The mountains are calling as they have always called, and now perhaps you can hear what they are saying. Sleep well, and let the bones of the earth hold you gently in their ancient embrace.